the so-called Code of Cultural and Environmental Heritage, a legislative decree converted in law in 2004. Article 178, the translation is mine, states that everyone counterfeits, alters, makes copy of a work of author gaining profit from it is punished with detention from 3 months to 5 years, etc. From this disposition, we can focus the main characters of counterfeiting author. First, the awareness of counterfeiter in his acting with malice. Second, the economical advantage he obtains from it by himself or through an intermediator, as to say an art dealer, who shares responsibility and punishment with the counterfeiter himself. The Code of 2004 has not marked the birth of the counterfeiting author as a crime in Italian legal system. Looking back to the first decades of the 20th century, we can observe that the robberies and the illegal exports of masterpieces followed the First World War produced several dispositions on the safeguarding our artistic heritage. All these dispositions, they were consolidated and articulated by Minister Giuseppe Bottai in an original body of norms, which also contained the prosecution both of counterfeiting author and illegal exports in the same article. But, as well I am a legal history, my history is mainly for the past, even if a recent past. And my question now is, how could a counterfeiting author be prosecuted before Bottai's consolidation was enforced under the rule of what disposition? Of course, under the rule of Italian criminal law, of Italian criminal code. The answer is obvious, but not entirely satisfying. Since the political and legal union of our country in a brand new Kingdom of Italy was completed, the criminal codes which succeeded in time, the Sardo-Piemontese one, the Zanardelli's one from 1889, the Rocco codes from 1930, which is partially enforced, ignored the counterfeiting crime. Counterfeiting author as a crime was assumed under the gender of the fraud. A crime whose point in fact was slightly different from counterfeiting author, as Article 7 and 40 of our criminal code shows. Everyone with tricks and deceptions misleads someone, gaining an economical advantage from it and damaging others is punished, etc. I think that the better way for introducing what is the focus of my proposal is asking the help to an exemplification which is very surprising, has been a surprising meeting also for me. I am referring to the exhibition Fakes, da Alceo Dossena ai falsi Modigliani, from Alceo Dossena to falsi Modigliani. In this day in Ferrara in Palazzo Bonaccorsi until the end of July. But who was Alceo Dossena? Alceo Dossena, who lived between 19th and 20th century, the first half of 20th century, was a good sculptor, a good painter, but most of all, he was a very, very skilled counterfeiter masterpieces of Italian Renaissance art, bought by the most important art galleries and museums in all Europe as true. In 1928, 1 year before Bottai's provisions, he was tried for fraud. Alceo Dossena was absolved as his advocates argumented and realized in convincing the judge that Dossena had been forced to his criminal behavior by his art dealer, who, probably scared in losing his economical advantage, threatened to denounce Dossena as a counterfeiter author as he really was. For his advocate, for the judge, Dossena acted for self-defense. Locating, registering, analyzing similar jurisprudential cases included between 1860 Italian Union and 1939 Bottai's dispositions, promises to become an improving field of research both in legal and in artistic front. For the first size, tasting the amount of flexibility of a codificated legal system as ours. For the second size, at the same time, providing useful information on a bad practice as counterfeiting author is, which in its own way is a form of art. Well, thank you for your kind listening.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Sarti. Very, very interesting approach. Very important indeed. And now, also from the University of Bologna, we have the Miguela. Sorry for the pronunciation. Who's going to talk us also about the protection of cultural heritage in the history of Italian law. Now, are you ready, Miguela? Yeah? Perfect.
Okay. As I was saying actually before introducing myself, the theme that I would like to show to you today is the protection of cultural heritage in the history of the Italian law between the 16th and 20th centuries. The need to safeguard artistic and cultural heritage has characterized all or almost all seasons of our history. But before analyzing the origins and the evolution of this legislation, it is appropriate to make a few clarifications. Firstly, The object of protection in the past has only partially coincided with the current concept of cultural heritage. It has not always been the same, but it has grown and become more specific over the centuries and societies. Secondly, the ways of protecting what we now call cultural heritage have changed over this long period of time that we are going to cover here. Thirdly, the causes of protection have become more precise, more sharp, and diversified in different historical periods. Actually, we have during the humanistic period, the church, the papal state, strongly felt the need to restore continuity with the past in order to evoke its splendor. So classicism became a model for the present, and for this reason, a new, albeit embryonic and circumscribed conscience of conservation and protection of all the historical artistic heritage. It is not yet possible to speak of real protection measures, but rather of discontinuous and fragmentary interventions, conceived from time to time by the popes in order to curb predatory behavior and avoid damage and dispersion. What we can say for sure is the fact that the papal state has represented a forerunner in the protection of cultural heritage. From this moment, the object of protection was no longer just immovable property, but also manuscripts. For example, the first nucleus of the Vatican Library was born in this century. Finds from archaeological digs and works of sacred art, especially marbles and tombstones. However, I cannot fail to point out a contradictory attitude in the policy of the humanist popes, who, on one hand, were the first to initiate this policy of protecting the historical and artistic heritage, but on the other hand, they did not hesitate to allow and even order the actual stripping of it in order to build and embellish new churches, new palaces, etc., etc. So, in addition to the regulations in order to protect urban decorum and control plundering, there were a lot of regulations that were needed to curb clandestine excavation and to protect the finds from the underground. From this moment, the past appeared more and more as something to be discovered and recalled, especially in the age of the Counter-Reformation, when the Roman Church could no longer limit itself to emphasizing its links with the past, but had also to bring back to memory those testimonies that linked this past with this church with the origins, the beauty of the origins. So to this end, the popes undertook powerful campaigns of intervention on Christian monuments, taking care of their protection and instituting in 1534 the office of Commissioner of Antiquities, the first real superintendent. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, monuments, ancient buildings, paintings, and sacred furnishings were protected, as were also the archaeological finds to which the pontiffs paid increasing attention. The main instrument of protection for movables was the export ban, the violation of which was severely punished. In the middle of the 17th century, the protection was extended for the first time to valuable movables held by private individuals whose clandestine sale was prohibited. The policy of safeguarding cultural assets in the Papal States was consolidated in the 18th century when there was a growing awareness of this aesthetic and both economic value of the artistic heritage considered a source of international prestige. For reasons of time, I'm not going to show it to you, but if it's necessary, I can share the slides. The legislation that protects cultural heritage in the Papal States since the late Renaissance was a model for all other Italian states of Ancien Regime. While in Tuscany and Naples there was considerable legislation on these subjects, as well elsewhere, for example, in the Duchy of Parma or Lombardy, it was limited to sporadic and circumscribed interventions. In the Kingdom of Sardinia, the first nucleus that will bring to the unification of Italy, it was not even present, this legislation, until the 19th century. In Tuscany, the legislation on cultural heritage was aligned with that of the papacy from the 16th century onwards, and the provisions issued between the end of the 16th and the 17th centuries remained in force in their fundamental lines throughout the Medici government. The Neapolitan legislation of Charles and Ferdinand of Bourbon also drew on the papal model, in particular the export control systems for cultural goods, which had been let down by the Valenti-Gonzaga Edict of 1750. The territory of the Kingdom of Naples abounded in classical and medieval remains and ruins. For these reasons, the sovereigns issued measures to protect both the archaeological and artistic heritage, prohibiting its exportation and also trying to regulate the excavation and the collection of finds. In the 18th century, it was the Republic of Venice that implemented advanced forms of protection of cultural assets and became an alternative model to the Papal State for two reasons, actually. Firstly, with regard to the object of protection, which was limited to paintings owned by the state and to, let's say, public paintings kept in ecclesiastical institutions. Secondly, regarding in particular the instruments, the means used to safeguard these assets, namely in the creation of a catalogue of all the paintings conceived by Anton Maria Zanetti the Younger, in order to prevent their sale and in the establishment of a public restoration workshop. At the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon conquered large part of the Italian peninsula and inflicted a severe blow on our artistic heritage. In the various peace treaties, he required the losers to compensate for war damage with valuable works of art, which were added to the many already stolen by the French armies. So hundreds of ancient and modern works of art, precious books and manuscripts, and rare archaeological finds were systematically removed from Italian territories and sent to Paris. Napoleon's work, let's say, was an enormous methodological operation of art theft, which on one hand was a plundering based on the right of war, and on the other hand was undoubtedly guided by this, let's say, enlightened desire to build up a universal collection. Following Napoleon's final defeat, the European countries tried to regain possession of their stolen property, not only Italy. With the Treaty of Paris in June 1814 and the subsequent armistice agreement of July 1815, the protection of the artistic heritage was dealt with at international level for the first time in law, requiring France to return the stolen works of art, since, I quote, they are inseparable from the country to which they belonged. As a consequence of this tragic plundering that took place under the Napoleonic age, the years of restoration saw the various Italian states engaged in a reinforcement of policies to safeguard cultural assets. Once again, the Papal State was the leader, the role model, which was concerned with safeguarding both monuments, which had to be protected and enhanced, and public and private movable artistic property, which was to be prevented from being alienated and, above all, of course, exported. After the unification of the Kingdom of Italy for more than 40 years, the regulations inherited from the pre-unification states regarding cultural assets remained in force, and it was only at the dawn of the new century with the law 1902, the so-called Nazi law on the conservation of monuments and objects of antiquity and art, that the discipline was unified throughout the country. This legislation, which is deficient in many aspects, bears witness to the spread of a more profound awareness of the themes of conservation, and present also several interesting and topical, let's say, reasons. It was followed by another important Italian law in June 1912, the last important piece of legislation on the protection of cultural heritage, of course, from an historical point of view, dates back to fascism. In particular, is due to Bottai, that we have already mentioned, the Italian Minister of National Education, Giuseppe Bottai. The law, it's a law of 1939, protection of things of artistic or historical interest. Bottai, this reform actually was responsible for the main preservation provisions on cultural heritage of the 20th century, because there were, let's say, measures of singular wisdom that contrasted with the imposing and distorting architectural and urban interventions on ancient cities during the fascist period. This law also defined the scope, the aim of protection by extending the object, so it included things, whether movable or immovable, that were of artistic, historical, archaeological, ethnographic interest. And in order to protect these assets, the legislation provided a set of instruments, some already known, some original. For example, the obligation for private individuals to report any transfer, and the provision that accidental fines belonged to the state, not to the individual. So they had to report to the competent authority in these cases. So this established the public monopoly of archaeological research, and the fact that these fines belonged to the state. From the Bottai reform emerged broad and articulated perspective on the social role of the cultural heritage. The historical, artistic, and environmental heritage was considered the center around which the identity of the Italian people was built and gathered. So therefore, the state had to be its guarantor, no more and no less than in Roman times. The Bottai laws was, as I have also shared with you in the slide, was considered as a highly advanced law, the best in the world, is a quotation of scientists, not only for their age, because they were born from the Italian tradition of protection, which was and is the oldest and most solid in the world, also from a legal point of view. The Italian this law dictated a discipline that has remained substantially unchanged to this day, because the Italian Civil Code of 1942 confirmed this legislation, and the Second World War, as we saw at the beginning, inflicted also on the Italian heritage, but not only on it, destruction, and so plundering of unprecedented severity led to the birth of UNESCO, as we saw, in the establishment of the monuments man. What happened actually, important...
You can conclude.
Yes, I'm finishing, thank you. Yeah. Is during the establishment of the Republic, the protection of cultural heritage became a constitutional value, in particular Article 9 of the Constitution, the environmental and historical artistic heritage is declared to be an indispensable tool for the cultural development of city seasons. And actually, it is very important if you think that in post-war Italy, when the country had to be rebuilt and industrialized, however, this constitutional norm appeared to be an excess of zeal on matters considered more or less marginal, and the attention paid to such delicate and urgent issues came to a halt. The turning point is the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry for the Protection and Enhancement of Things in 1964, and in particular it was only in 1999, 60 years after the Bottai laws, that the reorganization of all the preservation provisions enacted in the 20th century was finally achieved with the promulgation of legislative decree, Testo Unico sui Beni Culturali, which protected cultural, environmental, and landscape assets. 5 years later, the Testo paved the way for the first real rethinking of the entire discipline, and finally we have the Code of Cultural Heritage and Landscape dated 1st May 2004. Thank you for the attention.
So, hello from Krakow, and I just start. I will read, it will be easier, it will be faster, and I hope it will be more understandable. The purpose of my research is to analyze the condition of indigenous people's rights in the context of the protection, safeguarding, and management of their cultural heritage, especially those elements which have been recognized as the outstanding universal values and inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The second part of my research is to analyze the process of politicization of indigenous people's heritage, which I define as a process from monumentalization to participation in cultural policy. The issue of appropriation, the use of cultural heritage elements for political purposes, is a universal phenomenon that we can observe in many parts of the world. As a territory of reference, I choose Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist, area of significant and dynamic changes in the contemporary heritage policy and territory, where heritage issues became an instrument in the struggle of the implementation of indigenous people's rights and an important notion of decolonized discourse. The process of 21st century related to the modern conception of cultural rights and cultural plurality have introduced both the positive phenomena in the way of social use and protection of indigenous cultural heritage, as well as a lot of doubts in reference to its adequate and respected safeguard. In the historical perspective, the politicization processes of indigenous people's heritage link it successively with politics of colonialism, so cultural imperialism, then nationalism, populism, neocolonialism, endocolonialismo, and the contemporary concepts of interculturalism and ethno-development. Indirectly, they also determine the ethnopolitics in Latin American states and the change of the indigenous society's political and social status. In reference to the monumentalization processes, I just remind that the World Heritage Convention was adopted in 1972, so prior to the most of the significant international steps that have been taken to recognize and protect the rights of indigenous peoples. The convention, therefore, does not refer directly to those important steps. The main goal of the World Heritage Convention is the identification and collective protection of cultural and natural heritage sites of outstanding universal value, and for this purpose, UNESCO committee created the list of sites known as a World Heritage List. The list, on the one hand, remains the key element of UNESCO work, symbol of prestige and of what is best recognizable in heritage matter by the global public. But on the other hand, is also in the core of criticism and ongoing debate about the principles of the protection and respect of indigenous people cultural rights, as many objects referred to as outstanding universal value are at the same time elements of the local cultural heritage and part of indigenous cultural patrimony, source of indigenous people's identity and reference point for the political requests. As we know, the process of evaluation of the heritage objects or sites and their inclusion to the category of World Heritage is being applied only by countries that have signed the World Heritage Convention, and that only the governments of the member states can submit nomination proposals for properties on their territory. Consequently, adequate protection, conservation, and management of cultural objects and sites that are important for indigenous peoples depend on the government's culture policy and reflect the ongoing character of relationship between the indigenous community and state heritage agendas. In many cases, indigenous groups have not been even consulted when their territories were designated as World Heritage Sites, although designation for the famous list, UNESCO list, could have far-reaching consequences for their lives. The inscription on the list can lead to serious violations of the rights of the indigenous peoples that inhabit in or around the heritage sites. In some World Heritage areas, indigenous people are essentially treated as threats to their own territories and infrastructure. The system of patrimonial state management imposed on the basis of the Western norms of conservation and under the political economic strategies of heritage agents is leading to the appropriation of the sites and heritage objects under the centralist control and patronage of the state. In the last few decades, heritage has become a matter of political and economic negotiations between heritage agents and representatives of indigenous peoples under the line of fundamental queries. Who has the right to dispose and manage, and who should dispose and control heritage and its symbols? Who is the proper custodian of the material or intangible cultural heritage at the time when it becomes a symbol of the national heritage or symbol of universal outstanding value? Who should possess control over profits generated by mass tourism and popularity of World Heritage sites located on the territories of indigenous peoples? How indigenous communities can protect their rights to lands, territories, and resources, understood that recognized as a fundamental for their identity, development, and persistence from the political and economic appropriation by heritage agents. Indigenous peoples' limited participation in the nomination and inscription of World Heritage sites, their marginalization in the one-side decision-making management of World Heritage areas, violations of their right to share equally in tourism benefits, and forced displacement are interpreted as internal colonialism, endocolonialism. In Latin America, the shift from military dictatorships to democracy, which took place in many countries in the second half of 20th centuries, had led to the revision of the existing social relations and elaboration of new paradigms in social and cultural policy. The discourse between the state and indigenous peoples became an essential issue of the reforms introduced at the end of the previous century. Indigenous leaders, using the notions of neo-indigenismo or Indianismo, International Declaration on Human Rights, and discourse of decolonization, have deconstructed existing political theories and social standards, demanding new spaces for participation as citizens in their nationalized societies. During the first decade of the 21st century, Latin America went through unprecedented political changes. Most of its countries were led by the left-wing governments, a process defined as a progressive cycle. The progressive forces were diverse. However, the common pattern was rejecting the neoliberal cycle and promoting more egalitarian, anti-colonial, and participative principles of ethnopolitic practice. With the growth of democratization processes, we have witnessed new strategies for questioning the dominant values of the national society and negotiating changes in social structures and power relations. Therefore, a new quality of inter-ethnic relations gradually evolved from hegemonic relation up-down to horizontal and multi-sectoral ones. Modern standards of Latin American ethnopolitics, based on the concept of multiculturalism and interculturalism, reflected the provisions of the most important international documents relating to the rights of indigenous peoples. So, of course, Convention 169 and UN Declaration from 2007. Apart from the fundamental recognition of their rights to self-determination, consultations, and full participation in public life, those documents contain articles guaranteeing a wide range of cultural rights, including indigenous peoples' rights to access and use their cultural heritage freely and manage in according to their own vision. Most Latin American sites inscribed on the UNESCO list are monuments and places related to pre-Columbian heritage. The active participation of local communities in the nomination process should be then essential because it is the indigenous groups that may have relevant information on a given cultural property, both from form of its protection and safeguard and the best form of its use and management in accordance with local traditions or beliefs. Cultural heritage of indigenous peoples began to play, therefore, a significant role as an instrument of political negotiations for the implementation of indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, to autonomy, to lands and territories, to identity, as well as for the greater participation in the political and economic life, used as an argument of opposition to extractive activities against the monopoly of state in managing natural resources, or with purpose to obtain measurable benefits related to development of ethnic or ecotourism. My researches are focused on those modern dynamic changes in the indigenous heritage and politics relations of Latin America region, and particularly in Peruvian cultural policy. As a case study, I choose the national project called the Capacñan Project, an interdisciplinary program launched in 2001 by the Peruvian government to declare the pre-Columbian Andean road system on the list and as a symbol of world cultural heritage. Capacñan is an exceptional testimony of the achievements of the Andean civilization, proof of hundreds of years of cultural evolution, and it is final version a symbol of imperial policy of the Inca state Tawantinsuyo. Capacñan has not lost its functionality. For many contemporary Andean communities, comunidades asociadas, it is not only a symbol of pre-Columbian cultural heritage, but also an essential element of their social life and economic activity. It should also be emphasized that Capacñan is not only a network of roads, bridges, and a variety of complementary structures preserved in better or worse condition. The whole system is also linked to many traditions representing the richness and diversity of the Andean cultural heritage. For the inhabitants of the region, it is also a living road, a road saturated with spiritual energy. Its users emphasize the emotional bond that connects them with Capacñan, perceiving the trail as an integral element of the sacred space they lived in. In my research, I formed the questions: how, on the one hand, the patrimonial process of Capacñan, and on the other, the functionality of the trail can affect its management plans and protection as a World Heritage Site. To what extent it is possible to implement new ethnopolitical standards consistent with principles of multiculturalism and democratization processes. How do the methods of patrimonialization and hegemonic up-down relations on the one hand, and the concept of the co-management and the idea of sustainable development on the other, affect contemporary relation between representatives of indigenous peoples and public institutions? From its beginnings, the Capacñan project became a political initiative that corresponded to the need to strengthen the Peruvian democracy recovered after years of internal war. As some parts of the infrastructure were used during the war with Sendero Luminoso, it was necessary to change the meaning of and the function of the trail from a network used during an armed conflict by terrorists to a symbol of reintegration of the entire Andean region inhabitants. It has become an essential part of the slogans for national unity, and it's supposed to symbolize the reconstruction of the country's prestige on the international stage. It can be assumed, therefore, that during the first years of its realization, the Kapaknian project reflected the monumentalization processes of the Inca heritage, characteristic of Peruvian culture politics since 19th and 20th century. It was created as a source of symbolic revival of the Peruvian nation. At the same time, however, a symbol detached from the modern functionality of the state and separate from contemporary communities living in the neighborhood.
Can you conclude?
Yes, conclusion.
You can.
Nonetheless, the process of democratization of Peruvian cultural policy linked the aspect of the protection, safeguarding, and promotion of pre-Columbian heritage elements with the changing socio-political status of indigenous people, above all with the recognition of the right to full participation in any actions undertaken by the state. The new policy standards that are introduced by the Kapaknian projects are based on the concept of good government, buen gobierno, also combined with the idea of open government, gobierno abierto, promoted by the UN institution in the field of human rights protection, democratization processes, and the principle of sustainable development. The essential elements of this concept are the participation, transparency, responsibility, and coherence of all state actions with the needs and aspirations of its citizens. And Kapaknian project can be a good example of this buenas prácticas in culture politics in Latin America. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Marta, Kania. Now.
Thank you very much, Professor, and the organizers of this wonderful day and event. My name's Rolex Ruth Apondi Ombajo. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. And the topic for today, I have done an abstract from my doctoral research thesis, which comes around chapter 4 of my thesis. My topic is safeguarding the indigenous monument of Kitmikai, cultural rock, and sustainable development in Lake Victoria Basin of Kenya, the prospects for community inclusion. Now, as far as this topic for me is concerned, I'm not going to dwell 100% on law, but I am going to look at the international conventions and how the Kenya government has actually implemented these conventions towards protection, conservation, and a safeguarding of national and international monuments, which Kitmikai is a part of them. And therefore, because I'm looking at sustainable development as far as protection of monuments are concerned, we cannot omit the indigenous community. And that is why I'm looking at the prospects for community inclusion. Do they benefit? Do they not benefit? After safeguarding, protecting, and conserving of their indigenous monuments. Professor, move to the next slide.
Sure.
Thank you very much. This map is just to show you that the location of Kitmikai, first of all, is a rock. There are several rocks, 4 rocks together, put together. And then the location, we are talking about Lake Victoria. The blue waters that you can see on the map is Lake Victoria. And then the indication in red is showing the 4 sites which I'm doing in the overall PhD study. But the first one I've chosen is actually Kitmikai. And you can see it is also very close to the lake itself, and it falls on the mainland and not the island. And therefore, it is within the Lake Victoria Basin. Thank you. Next. A brief introduction about Kitmikai cultural rock. Kitmikai means the first wife. In Africa, men are polygamous, and also Muslims are polygamous. In the West, there's no polygamy. So Kitmikai means the first wife, and then cultural rock, it means that it was the rock for the first wife. It is a natural geographic 3 layers, rock lying on each other, and it is found within Kisumu County. The location is Seme. And you can see in the photograph, the 3 rocks lying on each other, and then the 2 rocks on the 2 small rocks on the side. So the downer is the husband. The middle is the first wife. It's cracked into 2, and then the second wife, and then up is the third wife. I want to ask myself 3 questions in this research. What are we protecting? Why are we protecting? And who is protecting? It's only those 3 questions that I will address. So we are protecting issues as far as this is concerned, because this cultural rock is historical. It has historical and indigenous knowledge. The Luo community that are found along who live along this particular rock have a lot of history on how it came about. Myths and legends of heritage tourism is how I call it. They say that a man once married, he had a first wife, then he married a second wife, he married a third wife, and then he mistreated the first wife. And the first wife used to go to the lake to cry to the gods. And then one day there was heavy rainfall in storm that swept the entire village. And what remained is actually the 3 layers of the rocks. Those are myths and legends of heritage tourism. So for safeguarding, it is important to protect this history, and it is important to protect this indigenous knowledge, and we will answer why. And also the community perceive this particular rock from as a shrine, and also from religious point of view. If somebody is sick, somebody is barren, somebody is dead, they believe that if they go and pray within this particular rock in terms of fasting, then their issues will be sorted out. And that gives us scope for safeguarding and protecting this natural monument. Then there is the socio-cultural, political, and economic importance among the Luo people. When we call it as a heritage attraction, it means that it comes with a lot of social benefits, cultural benefits for the people, economic empowerment for the people, and also environmental conservation and politics also. Because at the moment, this rock is supposed to be taken fully under the custodianship of the Kenya National Museums of Kenya, but the politicians are not allowing it to go. Therefore, it is important also to protect it and not leave it wholly at the hand of the government or the communities alone. This is a huge rock, and its measurement is 70 meters high. It is very tall. And actually inside the rock, there are caves. That's where people go to pray in terms of spiritual fulfillment. And this has been stipulated by Awange Obiero Onganga in the year 2006. Kindly move to the next slide. Now, I want to answer who should protect before I go to why. I've already answered what. I'm addressing the UNESCO 2003 convention. And before I go into that, I want to say that Kenya has a detailed legal and institutional framework to safeguard all its monuments, places, and structures of historical importance. As far as Kenya is concerned, there is what we call as Antiquities and Monuments Act, which was a Parliamentary Act 215 of the year 1984. This is what today the Kenya government, through the custodian of heritage, the umbrella of the National Museums of Kenya, is liaising with the UNESCO Convention 2003 to advocate for the following reasons of safeguarding all the monuments, and specifically to Kitmikai. The first one, safeguarding of tangible and intangible heritage. Kitmikai is a built heritage. It is a rock. It's a natural geographical rock that actually is found within Lake Victoria Basin. Intangibility, I'm looking at the activities which come in, and we'll see from the photograph after this slide, and I will explain why. We are looking at their spiritual and shrine activities. We are looking at their entertainment activities on the rock. We are looking at myths, legends, history, and retelling of this particular rock, and basically what it means from that to the community in terms of socio-cultural, economic, and environmental, which are the three main pillars of sustainable development. The other reason is inclusion of Kitmikai Cultural Rock in 2019. UNESCO had listed Kitmikai in its World Heritage Sites listing in the year 2019. Unfortunately, the world has been taken over by the emergence of COVID 2019 that came in the year 20 and also in the year 2021. So this issue is still not yet resolved, and I hope that by the time scholars like myself, we graduate, the benefit we want to give in terms of recommendation is to encourage the government to advocate and also enable UNESCO actually to give it full gazettement so that it becomes a World Heritage Site. And this is because we have native elites. For example, the father, Barack Obama Sr., the father of the former retired American President, Obama Jr., comes from with the region where we have this Kitmikai monument. The other reason why it needs protection, it is because it is a World Heritage Site, and it is also a national museum, a national monument under the Kenya National Museums of Kenya. It needs protection because of conservation of the intangible cultural heritage and also of its indigenous communities. Indigenous communities, I'm talking about the Luo communities who have lived around this rock hundreds and hundreds of years from the time they migrated to Kenya from Uganda, Ethiopia, and also the River Nile and settled alongside the basin of Lake Victoria. UNESCO has collaborated with the Kenya government through the National Museums of Kenya in the implementation process in the year 2019 and listed Kitmikai as a World Heritage Site, and therefore it deserves to be protected. Safeguarding and conserving heritage sites should be the responsibility of all stakeholders, and all these stakeholders I'm looking at through regional stakeholders, international legislative, and also policy frameworks, and that's why I'm adopting the UNESCO 2003 Convention among many other international legal frameworks. It is of great significance to engage these indigenous communities, the regional and also the international partners around the globe so that they can provide technical support for the preservation, restoration, and the long-term stewardship. So what we mean here is that when we look at safeguarding, protecting, conservation, it is not a one-man show. It requires collaborative approach and stakeholders' participation that is inclusive. And that is a good thing because it will fit in with the pillars of sustainable development as far as the UN is concerned. Thank you, Prof. Move to the next. Now, this research, what am I basically aiming at? Why? Okay, so safeguarding of this particular monument is a commitment to irreplaceable heritage monument sites within Kenya and Africa. If they are protected by law, if they are protected and there is policy framework to guide all the processes of these particular monuments, then it will not be easy to replace them. I know that UNESCO does not allow people to move monuments or replace them, but this particular natural rock can also not be moved by anybody, but it can only be moved by a natural metamorphosis, the same way it was formed. It will safeguard and respect for communities who devote themselves toward their indigenous heritage sustainability because of the retelling and the indigenous knowledge that they have. Therefore, if it is protected and it is restored, then it means that these communities will feel respected, and therefore they will continue to devote towards this particular agenda. It will revitalize the indigenous monuments of Kitmikai cultural rock of this particular community. It will identify and inventorize the mythology and values associated with this particular rock. So when we look at inventorizing, we are talking about the rock itself, the legends that come with it, the customs and the traditions, the festivities, for example, and all the intangible heritage characteristics that will befall this particular rock. It's also to encourage the indigenous community to recognize and appreciate their traditional practices in connectivity with the monument. When there is a law and a policy framework, then the community will be guided by what is moral and what is not moral. Because this law and policy frameworks will provide instruments for enforcing and controlling the negative behavior of the community that would lead to the erosion of this particular heritage monument. It is dedicated to saving, preserving, conserving the world's most treasured places, including architectural and socially significant sites. So the architectural design here is natural, but the people around Kitmikai, and especially hotels, they are building resort centers to camouflage the color and also the symbol of this World Heritage Site. Who are the beneficiaries? The regional, international heritage conservation agencies, the universities, like Paris 1, where I'm a student, and higher learning institutions for research in Africa and abroad, and then the indigenous communities themselves towards their socioeconomic and environmental benefits. These will be the beneficiaries of safeguarding and the law as far as this particular historical monument is concerned. Next. Okay, so these photos for me speak 1,001 words. Pictography of Kitmikai tangible and intangible heritage. There is a Kitmikai tourist site, which is a one-man show that speaks about so many activities. The first one, we are having the traditional dancers. They are wearing something made from natural environment sisal underneath, and they are dancing. They entertain the visitors always. That needs to be protected. Somebody in the morning spoke about the early afternoon, the first presenter was talking about law that will protect even copyrights. Therefore, if this is their dance and this is their way of dressing, then it needs to be protected from anybody trying to imitate that particular indigenous heritage of music and dance in terms of performance. Then there is the wedding reception. This is interesting. When I was a small girl, and what really encouraged me to actually study tourism to this level is because it was said, and it is still said, that if you accept to have a wedding at the Kitmikai cultural site, and then you allow the government to use your wedding pictures like what we are seeing there, the Kenya government will fund that wedding to the tune of around 2 million Kenyan shillings, converted into euros, should be around 17,000 euros. That will be given to you to organize this wedding, but then your picture will be used from one generation to another. The Kenya government, through monuments, will inherit that. So that also needs to be protected, and it is happening because you can see in that photo there was a wedding. Then the other one is a prayer shrine. There is a particular church, they call themselves Legio Maria. To me, they look a little bit like the sect. We'll find out when we go into the field for research. They pray and they believe that God can move mountains. They believe that if you are deaf and you pray around this particular rock, you'll be able to hear. If you're blind and you pray, you'll be able to see. If you're barren, you can't have children, they believe if you go and pray in the rock, they will be able to get children. So those are myths and legends of heritage tourism. And then there is traditional foods there is a calabash, there is porridge foods of the Luo community. When you visit Kitmikai, you're supposed to have some. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that this picture showcases the tangible and intangible artifacts and activities of Kitmikai monument that needs to be protected, needs to be conserved, and so that they can be passed on from one generation to another. There is the photo of the native elite, international celebrity, Kenyan, Mexican-born Lupita Nyong'o, and you see when she visited her home region, she paused and took a photo around Kitmikai so that she could sell it to international people, because with celebrities, everybody want to go to a country or a site where a celebrity has basically been. Continue.
I think you just have to finish up and conclude.
Yes, it's just so that is, the photos are just more or less the same like what we've said. So let's move to the last slide.
This one?
Yes, this one.
Okay.
Research benefits. I spoke about beneficiaries, but now what is the contribution of safeguarding this particular historical monument? One, it will be a good spirit of conservation, preservation, and it will also safeguard this monument in terms of tourism and also as a World Heritage Site, which is listed in Kenya by UNESCO. It will help in mapping, tapping, and digitizing of other indigenous heritage and cultural products within this particular region. Mapping means each and every tangible and intangible resources within Kitmikai will benefit from this particular safeguarding research. It will ensure that indigenous communities are major players in the protection and sustainable growth and transformation of their heritage. It will restore, preserve, and indigenize that Kitmikai's rich cultural heritage, including all the stakeholders involved. And the last one, it will, which should be a conclusion, this research will achieve the development of knowledge and indigenous heritage resources within Kitmikai, which will be a contribution to the World Heritage Site and also a framework of adoption for Kitmikai Monument by UNESCO through retrieving, identifying, protecting, and archiving of all the heritage industries around Kitmikai and also within Lake Victoria Basin. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me a chance to present.
Thank you very much, Rolex, and nice pictures.